The story I'm about to tell you was first told in the year 1436 in Briançon, France. That's where Claude Thulossin wrote a treatise that today is just known by the first sentence, which says, "So that the errors of magicians and witches might be made evident to ignorant people." That's the 1436 name of this. It's not my name for it. And, well, the story begins a group of witches traveling on a Thursday night with a troop of devils. They go out, usually Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays, and they kill children. And then they boil the children and they eat the children. Ew, right? So once they've had their fill of babies, they travel to a remote place where they have what's known as a synagogue of witches. The witches tell the devil about all their acts of witchcraft. They brag about themselves and basically give a progress report on what they've been up to since the last synagogue of witches. Some of the witches travel on staffs coated with baby fat and powder and devil pee. Others travel on beasts or brooms. But when they get to this remote place for the synagogue and they see the devil, they kiss the devil. And then they have sex with each other and other demons.
I have a question.
Other demons.
Where did Claude come up with his account?
So Claude Thulossin was a chief magistrate in Briançon, which is in southeast part of France in the historic province of Dauphiné, which isn't a province anymore since the king took it back later in the 15th century. But anyways, Claude Thulossin, he spent 10 years trying over 100 witches in his career and decided that he was going to write down his observations because he didn't want ignorant people falling into the same traps, making the same errors as these magicians and witches. And this is just me thinking, but probably this guy, being the chief magistrate, he probably thought that just about everybody was ignorant. So he probably didn't really mean it as an insult the way we would take it today. But one thing that motivated Claude Thulossin for writing this was that he believed that witches had not just violated religious laws and standards, they'd committed treason against the French monarch. So they were a threat against both the church and the state. And as his position as a royal magistrate appointed by the king, he really felt a sense of duty to France. So I think that's probably why he wrote it. But he also seems to have been, he didn't shy away from writing about the more lurid parts of the testimony. So maybe he was genuinely fascinated by it or, just had an interest or curiosity, we shall say.
Well, before we dig into the juicy part of the story, let's welcome everybody.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Thing About Witch Hunts. As you've noticed, we're talking about meetings of witches today, or as they're commonly known today, the Witches' Sabbath.
He's Josh, and I'm Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. I forgot who I am today. The witches recruit people who are motivated by vengeance or lust. They use those as recruitment tools. And then, like the first rule of Fight Club, you don't talk about what happens at the synagogue. Back to the witches gathered near Briançon, which is in the Alps in southeast France. Very beautiful, mountainous, gorgeous area. But there's all these witches and there's this devil. And according to Claude Thulossin, these witches, this is not a beautiful thing that's happening here. And one reason it's not beautiful is because, well, they place a vessel in the center of a circle. The devil who's leading the meeting comes up and pees in that vessel. Then the witches, showing their obedience and they'll do anything for this devil, they drink from the vessel, place it back in the circle, flip it over, and renounce Christ. So definitely something Claude would have been concerned about.
And then he tattles that they then turn their posteriors and naked ass to heaven as an insult to God.
They moon God. And then they make a cross in the soil. They spit on it 3 times, and then they trample it under their feet.
They make an obscene gesture 3 times to God and toward the rising sun.
After all of this gesturing is done with, they kiss the devil on the mouth, and they give over their body and soul to the devil.
These gatherings were all about their submission to the devil and turning their back on God. And so there's been a pact with the devil.
There's a pact with the devil, and they quite literally turn their backs on God, or the backsides. Now, after they've given themselves body and soul to the devil, they give him something else. One of their own children, usually their firstborn, as a sacrifice. They kill the baby right there, bury it, dig it back up, and make powders from it.
It almost sounds like a vampire story.
Yeah. And Claude tells us that the devil appears however the witch wants to see him. So if the witch wants to see a hunky beefcake, that's the way the devil comes. If the witch wants to see a fuzzy animal, he'll come as a little teddy bear. He'll just come however they want to see him because it puts them at ease and it's easier to get them to submit.
Now, I know we're going to touch on this in a little bit when we talk about the gatherings in Salem of the alleged witches. But does Claude talk about the devil giving them fine things? Is he luring them with luxury?
Yeah, he's luring them with the offer to have wanton and gratuitous sex. That's one of the things. He's luring them to have vengeance upon their enemies. So according to Claude, these are the 2 big things that are promoting people. It's lust and vengeance. They want to have revenge on anybody who's wronged them. And they want to get jiggy with it.
And I just want to remind our audience that when you're referring to Claude, you're not referring to Claude AI.
This was a little bit before AI. Back in the good old days, according to some that don't like that new technology. But obviously, they're talking about witch trials, so not so great a time. And Claude Tolosan also tells us that the witches make an annual tribute payment to the devil, which is usually a sacrifice of another child if they have one. And they do this on the anniversary of when they first pledged allegiance to him.
Claude describes the devil as having a body like glass that does not block the rays of the sun. Is that before or after he takes the form of the creature that the witch would prefer? That's so fascinating. I don't know.
It is so fascinating. It's once, like, I picture it happening at the same time, that he's more or less, he's like translucent. Like you can see through him a little bit, but not all the way. Sunlight comes through him, but you can still see his figure. He's an ephemeral being. One interesting thing that these witches do that Claude Tolosan talks about is they kind of go on field trips from the synagogue. The devil takes them out to other people's houses that have fine things, good wine, good food. They go to these places, He opens up the doors for them. The troop goes in, they eat and drink whatever they find in the house that they like. And then they perform all kinds of wicked things that Claude doesn't really describe. So then the witches and a bunch of demons get together and have a dance party to some musical instrument that also isn't, it's not described, the musical instrument, just that there is a musical instrument that they dance to. So while this is going on, the chief devil of the whole region, however the devils have carved up the world and they have their, diocese or province or whatever they call these regions, the chief devil is there. He sits on a throne and the witches come up and pay him reverence and they give their reports of their wicked deeds like they did at the synagogue with that devil.
So they're not reporting on each other. They're reporting with pride what they've done.
They did.
Wicked.
Exactly. They're like, hey, I tripped this boy the other day. Or, hey, I poisoned this pot of stew. It's like, we did all this.
Allegedly by Claude. This is according to Claude.
According to Claude Thelosin, who had 10 years of experience working on this, he says his experience would have been from about 1426 to 1436. And unfortunately, not all of the records of these witch trials survive. These witches, they make poisonous powders. They get poisons from apothecaries, probably rat poison and that kind of thing, pesticides and herbicides. They mix that together with more urine from a devil and other poisons that they get from animals and plants. When they apply these poisons to their enemies, they themselves become invisible, so the enemy doesn't see them applying the poison. This enemy of theirs, their target, they get sick right away, and either they linger and die, or they just die instantly.
Well, that sounds like 100% of deaths.
You are correct. You definitely aren't wrong. Everybody either lingers sick or they just die right away. But sometimes these afflictions would appear as ulcers. Another concoction that they make is intended to make women infertile and also to drive people insane. And they use a long thistle, more devil pea, they're really obsessed with this, and what they call the cock's egg. As you well know, roosters don't lay eggs, but these were small, yolkless eggs that sometimes were laid, and people didn't understand what they were, so they just called them cock's eggs. And they used these in a concoction to make women infertile because they were really obsessed with not being fruitful and multiplying.
All the descriptions of the behavior, the sacrilege of these alleged witches, this perception's been going on for hundreds of years before the afflicted of the Salem witch trials also describe a Sabbath.
So now that we've told you a story of a Sabbath, let's talk about the history of how the Sabbath theory came about, okay? Back in the medieval period, maleficium existed, bad magic, harmful magic existed in people's minds, but they didn't associate it with group activities like a Sabbath. That didn't exist in the medieval period. They didn't believe that witches were an organized sect or that they were part of a diabolical conspiracy. That, yes, witchcraft might be bad, but it wasn't involving the devil or demons, so it wasn't that bad. Anyways, along come the 1430s, and we're here in the Western Alps, so southeastern France, western Switzerland, northwestern Italy, and witch trials are happening within the Inquisitions. So hundreds of people are being brought in for trial in these areas in the early 15th century. And people start to write about what's happening at these witchcraft trials and what the witches, supposed witches, are confessing under great torture. So think about that when you're hearing these accounts. The witches were highly under duress, in a lot of pain, and just saying whatever they thought that the people wanted to hear. And as we know from the Salem witch trials, the judges like to ask leading questions and probably steered people down some of these roads. And then after that, just word of mouth about what was said spread around, and people knew what to confess to. We want to talk just briefly about these writings in the 1430s. There are 5 major writings that talk about Sabbaths. And one thing that's interesting is that none of them use the word Sabbath. They use the word synagogue, like in our story, or assembly. So Sabbath doesn't actually come up until the 17th century, by the way. The first account that happens is written in 1429 or 1430 by a man named Hans Freund, and it tells about a series of witch trials in Valais canton, which is now in southwestern Switzerland, but hadn't joined the Swiss Confederation yet at that point in time. And when he wrote this, witchcraft trials had been going on for about a year and a half. They started in 1428. And more than 100 people were executed for witchcraft, according to Hans Freund. He even, towards the end, that number grows to more than 200. So, like we said, the records aren't very thorough, what's survived to today. So an estimate of 100 or more people is probably right. And these witch trials went on until at least 1436. So even after Hans had written this. But, you know, we talked before about the whole church and state thing and how Claude Tolosan thought witches had committed treason against the king of France. Well, Hans Freund thought that the witches, given a little bit more time without these trials happening, they would have been able to raise up a king from among their number. That's how numerous and powerful they were.
It's so hard to decide which writing title is my favorite because every time we dig into history, I'm so fascinated by the titles. But this one's pretty good. So a third writing from the 1430s, those who are proven to write on a broom or staff, that's pretty good. It was anonymous. It was called Aurore's Gazariorium, Errors of a Gazari. And it is presumed to have been written by a church recorder and likely connected to a series of witch trials in the Val d'Aosta in northwest Italy, possibly written by Franciscan Inquisitor Ponce Figueron.
Among the other juicy and salacious details that we get about the Sabbath in this account is this bizarre twist. Okay, so these witches, when they go to their synagogue or assembly, they find a red-headed Catholic, so a non-witch, true believer in the Catholic faith, red-headed. So they take this poor red-headed Catholic, they bind him to a bench, surround him with poisonous animals like snakes and toads and lizards that they think are poisonous. And they have all these poisonous animals bite the victim repeatedly until the victim dies a very painful death. Then they hang the body by its feet. They place a glass under the mouth to catch the poison dripping out of the mouth, along with any impurities coming out of the body with the poison. Then they take this poison and impurities, they mix it up with the fat of those who hanged on gibbets, very specifically, and innards of children, and also poisonous animals. And so they've got this part, redheaded Catholic unguent that kills any person instantly on contact.
I'm speechless. I was just thinking how you couldn't come up with it's anonymous, but I'm like, with panic about satanic rituals and behaviors that are happening in modern times or in recent centuries, this is 1437 and these stories were circulating.
Yeah. And it's so the creativity, the imagination to come up with something like that, very particular.
Very particular.
Another influential work to come out in the 1430s was Formicarius, or The Anthill, written by Johannes Nieder, starting in either 1436 or 1437 and completed in 1438. Unfortunately for Nieder, that's the year that he died also, so he didn't get to witness the effects of his writing. And Formicarius features an account by a man named Peter of Bern about witch trials that happened in Bern in Switzerland. And this is the western part of Switzerland, so it fits with our Western arc here, if we're thinking about Switzerland, France, and Italy on the side of the Alps. And one thing that's notable about Nieder is he was the first clerical writer, not just in this little niche genre about witchcraft, but in any genre. He was the first to explicitly state that women were more likely to become witches than men were. Now, in his account, he does talk about male witches and female witches, but he says that women are more prone to be seduced into witchcraft. For more on the Formicarius and Johannes Nieder and Peter of Bern, check out our devil episodes that we recently did with Richard Raiswell. He talks some length about this work here and what it meant for the definition of witch and witchcraft.
In the last writing that we're going to talk about from this era, the Vaudery of Lyon, it is anonymous, likely written by a Dominican inquisitor. The Vaudery of Lyon describes witch activity around the city of Lyon in southeast France, and it paints a very disturbing image of a monstrous devil. And I'm going to paint that for you right now. The devil, cunningly deceiving these wretched people, always presents himself to them visibly in a horrible form, as they themselves confess, sometimes in the form of a very repulsive man that is black, completely covered with hair and bristles with thorns, and also having a monstrous, drawn-out, and twisted shape. He has bulging eyes larger than any animal known to us, flashing and emitting flame and constantly rolling about, a big and crooked nose, exposed ears set high up, emitting and sending forth fire, a gaping mouth twisted upward on both sides and extending all the way to his ears. That sounds like Pogo the Clown.
I was thinking about the Joker with Jack Nicholson.
A tongue striking far out, a chin monstrously stretched and bent back terribly to the other side of his throat, a neck long beyond measure so that it juts out horribly, or too short so that it looks like his head is joined directly to his shoulders, a chest, belly, and other such parts inconceivably deformed. Finally, all along his arms and hands, as well as his legs and feet, hooks and long spines stick out, and the digits of his hands and feet bear terrible claws in the manner of griffins, or bears or lions. Sometimes, in fact, the demon is accustomed to appear to them in the form and likeness of some beast, but always unclean, foul, and extremely vile, such as a goat, fox, large dog, ram, wolf, cat, badger, bull, bear, monkey, or something else of this sort, as these perverted people confess.
Wow. that is some description of the devil. I have so many questions, but like, how is fire coming out of the eyes and ears? It's very like, I mean, this guy, if you saw this in the middle of the night, oh man, just collapse on the spot.
If you want to read more on this history, read Michael D. Bailey's Origins of the Witches' Sabbath.
Excellent book. Highly recommend it. It's got excerpts from these writings, so you can see the accounts firsthand for yourself.
And that's available in our bookshop?
Yes.
bookshop.org/shop/and witch hunts.
Yay. So talk briefly about the impacts of these accounts and also a little bit about what they're based upon. These accounts caused both secular and religious authorities to fear this organized sect of witches. As we talked about before, both the church and the state were vulnerable now to this powerful group that could undermine their authority or outright depose them. The witches posed an existential threat now to Christendom. Before this diabolical pact and this coming together in these gatherings, there wasn't a fear that witches could bring down the church and the state because witches usually acted alone. And these gatherings, you can tell based on the original name for them, synagogue, they are based on anti-Jewish stereotypes from the Middle Ages. And they're also based on imagined gatherings of heretics. Now we'll regale you with tales of witches' Sabbaths from New England, from the Salem witch trials, in fact. In the Salem witch trials, the first 6 weeks or so from the accusation of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, those first 6 weeks or so go by, and the witches are mostly working individually or in very small groups. But come April 11th, that changes. Because during the examination of Sarah Cloyce and Elizabeth Proctor, Abigail Williams is questioned about a meeting that she was known to have observed. So this one, the April 11th hearing, is the one that Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth presides over, and Samuel Sewell is here. And Deputy Governor Danforth, he doesn't become a part of the Salem court, but Samuel Sewell does. So you also have here, of course, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin as magistrates. So it's not clear who asks this question, but the question is asked by one of these judge peoples. One of these judicial types asks this question. It might have been Hathorne because he asked all the questions in the other preliminary examinations. He goes, Abigail Williams, did you see a company at Mr. Parris's house eat and drink? And she says, yes, sir. That was their sacrament. How many were there? About 40, and Goody Cloyce and Goody Good were their deacons. What was it? They said it was our blood, and they had it twice that day. So here we are with the first Sabbath. It's not referred to as a Sabbath. It's referred to as a company eating and drinking. And it's at Samuel Parris's pasture. And it's involving 40 witches, including deacons, Sarah Cloyce and Sarah Good. And we get this detail, which only comes up this one time, that the witches used the blood of the afflicted in their concoctions that they consumed at these meetings or assemblies or companies. Next person to talk about the witches' gatherings in Salem is Abigail Hobbs. And she's a confessed witch, and she's Sarah's favorite.
She is. she has no shame in her friendship with the devil. And sorry, she shocks. I mean, we're shocked by the Salem story, but she was in the story telling the shocking stuff to her community. So I just, think that's so great.
Yeah,
Except
she's a
for
wild
that,
one.
her accusations, of course, were hurting innocent people. That is not great.
No, and she really stuck to her accusations, and even though she knew what was happening to them and what happened to herself, she actually ends up getting condemned to die after she's convicted, even though she was a confessor. She does get condemned to die, but she gets a last minute reprieve from the governor.
Let's hear her story.
So Abigail Hobbs, she talks very briefly about this witch meeting that she was at in Paris's pasture. That's how we know it was the pasture at his house where they had this meeting. And she talks about them having red bread and red wine. So yes, red bread, just like that. They would break red bread. Presumably it's red because of blood, but they don't specify. The red wine does later get specified as blood wine. So then 3 days after Abigail tells this story, her stepmother, Deliverance Hobbs, tells the story on April 23rd. She's being examined in the Salem prison by the judges, and she talks about a witch meeting that happened just the day before, April 22nd, which somehow she must have traveled to from the prison because she was already under arrest. As we mentioned, Chichiba had mentioned that there were 9 witches in the area that included Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, but she didn't know the other 7. Well, Deliverance Hobbs finds another 7, plus the original Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. So she finds a total of 9 people at this witch meeting she recognizes are John Proctor, Elizabeth Proctor, Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, Martha Corey, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good, and Sarah Wilds. So 3 Sarahs, Sarah. A lot of Sarahs, just got to say.
They're always in trouble.
And another thing that these 9 people have in common is they all died when they shouldn't have in 1692. They were either hanged, or Giles Corey was pressed to death with stones, and Sarah Osborne died in jail. So none of them made it through this unscathed, but they had all already been accused at the time that Deliverance is mentioning them.
She, of course, says the ringleader is the minister George Burroughs, who'd been accused. He also ends up executed.
Yeah. So everybody she names perishes. And so George Burroughs was the preacher there. He pressed the witches to bewitch everybody in the village, but to do it gradually. Then he gave the red bread and red wine to Sarah Wilds, who distributed it while he presided over the version of witch communion, whatever the witches would have called it. There's also a detail here that George Burroughs sits at a table in the Samuel Paris's pasture, and next to him is a mysterious man in a long-crowned white hat. And the man in the long-crowned white hat is filling tankards with this blood wine. Goody Wilds was the one who gave notice of the meeting. Deliverance Hobbs claimed in her confession that she refused to eat or drink this blood, bread, and wine. And then she was harassed by the other witches who all did consume themselves. A mysterious detail emerges in this testimony. Abigail Williams, afflicted girl, comes out and talks to somebody. But Deliverance Hobbs is blinded at just that moment, and she doesn't know who she talks to. Sarah Wilds, who had distributed the bread and wine, also pressured Deliverance Hobbs to sign the devil's book in exchange for some clothing.
It's obvious the Salem gathering of alleged witches was just as detailed as the century-old tales.
A lot of these details in the Salem accounts were borrowed from these earlier accounts that, kept being repeated over the centuries. The same stories of witches' Sabbaths were repeated in Europe, and word of that got over to New England, and here it comes out in these stories when they're being pressed to confess. A final thing that I'll mention is that as these stories went along, as more and more people were being accused, the number of witches at these meetings grew and grew and grew. So you had Abigail Williams with 40, then you had 100 people when Mary Lacey Jr. told the story. Then you had 200 people soon after that, and 300 people, and people were coming in from Connecticut for these meetings. And again, it's always described as a meeting, a company, an assembly, not a Sabbath. That's a term that we apply to it because that's what we understand is the witch's Sabbath. So the Sabbath became such an important part of the stories of witches, the lore. It was what was expected to be told in court and during questioning. And it became a big piece of the evidence against these witches was them going to the Sabbath, because that set up the connection to Satan, to making the witchcraft diabolical, and to the satanic pact, and to this grand satanic conspiracy to destroy Christendom. And we see that very clearly expressed in the writings of Cotton Mather about the Salem witch trials, when he talks about the devil. And this is also in some of the records themselves. They talk about the devil and the witches wanting to destroy Christ's church and set up the devil's kingdom in its place. And this crucial link to this overwhelming existential threat to society, to religion, to politics, this overriding apocalyptic threat was just so scary that this is what led to the excesses of the witch hunts. Everybody was so afraid that there was this massive conspiracy out there. At least the elites were afraid of this, terror petrified. And that's why they kept saying, "You witch, you've been at these meetings. Tell us who else was there. We want you to name names." And then we go after those people. And they name names. And we go after those people. And you see how this quickly spiraled out of control.